Hi, today I'll introduce a paper called Voting to Tell Others, which is published in Review of Economic Studies 2017. These days, it seems like there's a social phenomenon that people post things about voting encouragement, and I voted kind of stickers in social media such as Instagram and Facebook. Why are these things happening? Do people perceive showing that I voted as some kind of utility? Then do people who did not vote feel shame or disutility? The authors asked some questions, and they wanted to know whether there's social image motivation for voting. In the first part of the paper, the authors assumed that if individuals care about what others think of them, the person who voted could advertise their good behavior. But for people who did not vote, they could admit and feel shame or just lie. So, based on these assumptions, the goal of this paper is to estimate the model of voting to tell others based on social image motivation. So let's talk about the model the authors used. The first model is for voting. Individuals vote if the net expected utility of doing so is positive. In here, we have the first three terms: pivotality, or glow, which means impurely altruistic, and transaction cost. But these components are not the ones that the authors focused on. The important part is this underlined expected social image, which is the social image motivation to vote. As you can see in this picture on the left, when someone truly voted, they could tell the truth or they could lie and pay the line cost L. People who did not vote, they will have the same choice here. There are actually some assumptions in this model. The variables SV, Sn, and L could depend on a variety of factors, such as whether one's party won the election or not. And also in this paper, variable L is restricted to have the same value regardless whether a person truly voted or not, for simplicity's sake. Based on the original model, it could be rewritten like this, whether epsilon is sum of other regions to vote. In this figure 1, you can see that in order for a social image to contribute to voting, the net utility SB minus Sn, it must be non-zero, and the line cost L must be positive. To estimate this model, the authors designed a door-to-door survey which had a variety of questions, including the one whether they voted or not. The total utility from survey completion is like the one at the top, as you can see, and consumers have a baseline utility of completing a generic 10-minute survey with no payment, which is S, and pyramidal S can be positive or negative to reflect that individuals may find surveys interesting or they just dislike it. Individuals receive utility from a payment M and this utility from C, which is time cost. In some treatment cells, the incentives are also provided for the respondents who said that they did not vote. The incentives is either in terms of time, which is an 8-minute shorting of the survey duration, or in terms of money, an extra $5 for 1 more minute of questions. So, maybe you're curious about why the authors gave monetary incentives to people who said that they did not vote instead of people who did vote. The authors did not mention about actual regions in the paper, but I think the authors maybe wanted to align the incentives because it was so obvious in the survey that person who said that they did not vote will have a shorter survey time. And also, if you give incentives to people who only said I voted, you may not be able to see the pure social image motivation to vote because it might be get associated with monetary incentives. Now let's look at the experimental design of this paper. The main experiment took place in the summer and fall of 2011 in the suburbs of Chicago. The surveyors visited households and asked whether they were willing to answer a short survey, including a question on whether they voted in the 2010 congressional elections, as I mentioned earlier. The treatment was a combination of 4 cross-interventions: flyer treatments, payment and duration to survey content announced to door, and lastly, the incentives to claim non-voter status. We're going to walk through these 4 interventions from next slide. So these are the flyer samples that the authors used in the survey. First, each household was randomized into 5 flyer treatments with equal weights. No flyer, survey flyer in the left, election flyer in the middle, and after flyer with a checkbox. A second cross-randomization involves the duration of the survey as well as the compensation offered for completing the survey. After the flyers were all distributed, the surveyor comes and knocks on the door. The third set of cross treatments, as you can see in the top part of figure 3, it involves how the surveyors describe the survey wants. If a household member opens the door, the surveyor will first introduce about the duration and compensation. And for the election mentioned group, the surveyor will start the survey as, "Hi, the survey is about your voter participation in the 2010 congressional election. Do you think you might be interested?" And for the election not mentioned group, the surveyor would just simply ask, "Hi, we're doing a survey. Do you think you might be interested?" The fourth set of cross treatments, as summarized at the bottom of figure 3, it involves incentives to affect the response to a turnout question. So, for example, for a subject in 10-minute $10 survey treatment group, the authors offered an 8-minute incentive to the respondent to state that he or she did not vote, because the survey will just end earlier, and for $5 group, they offered a monetary incentive. So now let's talk about the results of the experiment. The top part of figure 5 shows the results for voters, pulling across the different survey durations and payment incentives. There was not much difference for voters in the share opening the door or the share completing the survey between the survey flyer and the flyer election treatment. Between opt-out and opt-out elections, there is a decrease in the share of voters opening the door and the share completing a survey. So we can see that there is a little evidence of pride from voting, and voters prefer not to be asked whether they voted or not. For non-voters, on the other hand, in the bottom part, the difference between the flyer and flyer treatment is large. This result indicates strong avoidance of non-voters due to shame from admitting to non-voting and disutility from lying. However, the authors admit that this may depend on the election, because in this 2010 congressional election, Republicans won and Democratic voters are more disappointed. Next, the authors estimated the rates of how much voters and non-voters misrepresent their voting behavior, and how individuals respond to the randomized incentives for voters to lie and non-voters to tell the truth. The authors used a OLS regressions and figured out that the incentive treatments have a small effect on voters. They lie 2.7 percentage points more when incentivized to do so, which is not statistically significant. But for non-voters, the effect is highly significant and has a 20 percentage point decrease in lying rates. This result indicates that voters seem to greatly dislike lying and claiming to be non-voters, while non-voters are more easily moved between telling the truth and falsely claiming to be voters. So let's summarize the results of this experiment. Among voters, there was a little evidence of pride in voting on average, but this does not imply that the social images do not motivate their voting behavior. Because, as mentioned in the previous slide, even with incentives, over 85% of voters refused to say that they did not vote. This indicates that voters have a high lying cost and low social image value of being a non voter, which can be interpreted as high social image value of voting. For non voters, the results show that non voters experience stigma on average from non voting. Also, a $5 incentive reduces lying by 25%, indicating that a substantial share of non voters are actually close to margin in their decision to tell the truth or lie. Now, let's move to the structure estimate section and see the experimental treatments that authors used to estimate the social image value of voting. The authors computed the value of voting to tell others, averaged over the population, as you can see in the formula at the top. A key parameter for the value of voting to tell others is the expected number of times asked, and given the assumption that the social image utility accumulates with each additional ask. On average, respondents report being asked about 5.4 times for the 2010 congressional election. The first part of table 4, as you can see here, the authors estimated a total value of voting to tell others of $18.3 for voters and $13.3 for non-voters. There are three important caveats in this measure. First, the value depends on the parametric and distributional assumptions, and it varies from a wide set of sensitivity checks. And second, authors estimate the social image utility when asked by a stranger, If social image concerns of lying costs when interacting with friends, family, and their colleagues are higher, the estimates are likely to be lower bounds of the social image value of voting. Third, the estimates are they assume that the value of being asked is linear in the times asked. So if utility is instead concave, the authors could be underestimating the value. The authors also calculated the implied turnout and wearable effects on the get of the voting intervention. Non-voters are estimated to have a more negative utility from being asked minus 5.9. This is because, on average, individuals do not derive pride from voting and they strongly dislike admitting that they did not vote. The authors also predicted the effectiveness of the intervention. Given the distribution of the other regions to vote, this GOTV intervention is predicted to increase turnout by 0.3 percentage points and result in a utility cost of $1,189 for additional vote yielded. So finally, now is the conclusions of this paper. The first point is that individuals vote because they expect to be asked and they anticipate the disutility associated with admitting to not voting or relying about voting. Second, the authors figured out that this utility associated with the intervention is actually likely to dwarf the administrative cost. This highlights the importance of GOTV interventions, so that's probably why the government is continuously working on the voting encouragement. Third, in the methodological perspective, this article is very unique in terms of providing monetary inducements to individuals, which previous studies didn't. Also, we can see the tight link between a simple model and the experimental design, which could be applied to future research. Also, I think this paper can give you further thoughts, such as, oh, does social media impact voter turnout? Because social media, your activities are being watched by the people, and I thought that this could be interpreted as social pressure or some kind of indirect asking. So I searched for 2020 voter turnout because compared to the ones in the previous election, social media usage has significantly increased. And according to this post in University of Maryland that I linked down below, experts believe that social media has positively impacted civic engagement, registration, and early voting across the board. Since the social media phenomenon is really new, I'm looking forward to this kind of research, which try to find insights about voting engagement. Thank you for listening.